Welcome to the Being Human UTU podcast, where Dr. Randy Jasmine and Dr. Jim Hindigus will discuss issues relative to the humanities and technology at Utah Tech University. And now your hosts for Being Human UTU podcast, Dr. Randy Jasmine and Dr. Jim Hindigus.
Welcome to episode number 9. We've got a great episode planned with plenty of guests. And to introduce our topic, I'm going to turn it over to my partner, but I forgot to say my name. So I'm Randy Jasmine.
Everybody knows you, Randy. And I'm Jim Hindigus, and this is an episode that we're going to talk about something that is sort of invisible, and we encounter in the educational space all the time. And so when we were thinking about topics in January, I thought, well, I've just spent a significant portion of time prepping my classes in Canvas. Let's talk about Canvas. And that's a technology that you use all the time. It impacts humanities, impacts all the things we do. But yes, like Randy said, we have a full house today. And so I want to have the people in here introduced. We've never had this many people in here. In fact, I may or may not admit that my having the extra people have caused technical difficulties, which is kind of exciting. So anyways, I want to introduce here the people in this room.
Hello, everyone. I am Rachel Huntsman Baldwin. I am a master's student here doing the technical writing and digital rhetoric program, and I am also a graduate assistant instructor. So I'm teaching English 1010 and 2010 this semester.
I'm Carrie McCushin. I'm also a graduate student in the Technical Writing and Digital Rhetoric program, and so I teach 1010 and 2010, and I am a non-traditional student, but I did most of my undergrad online and teach now.
And I'm Ethan Morin. I'm a undergrad literary studies major. Excited to be here.
Ethan's going to be the person with the eyes on the other side of the wall. The rest of us use Canvas to teach and to instruct. And, you know, it's funny because I even had an incident like this happen yesterday where a student was saying, I'm seeing this in Canvas. This is happening in Canvas. And I had to have that student, you know, on the classroom computer pull up their Canvas page because I don't see the other side. I don't see the student side, and there are differences to it. And so we're really glad to have Ethan here and get his feedback as far as what the student side of Canvas looks like, because I'll be perfectly honest with you, over the years when I've heard about problems with Canvas, it's usually from the student side, that what we think as instructors is going out to our students isn't always exactly what they're seeing. So this is going to be a great discussion about, you know, Jim, in your opening comments, you used the word invisible, and that kind of struck me. We do think of it as being there, and we don't even realize it. We just expect it to be. So I'll just kind of open up with this question to the group. What kinds of, I mean, would you be surprised if you walked into a classroom and you had an instructor who didn't run most of their class through either Canvas or some other kind of learning management system?
Yeah, I think so. I've had instructors who don't like to even post their courses until the first day of the class. And even that is like a curveball, because for me, when it's the start of a new semester, I like to get an idea of, like, you know, what's on the syllabus, at least on the first couple of pages, what are the books, you know, I like to get an idea of what I'm walking into. And so if somebody decides not to post that, for me at this point, it's almost an expectation that, you know, 3 or 4 days before I actually show up for class, I can get some information on the course beyond just the name of the course. And so if I walked into a class and they were like, oh, you noticed it wasn't on Canvas. There's nothing on Canvas. I'm not going to post to Canvas. We're not going to use it. I would be shocked.
Yeah, and we've been instructed to do that, to post it several days in advance. And what I usually do, and I know our department chair suggests this, is put up a little message in the first page saying this course is this page is under construction until the first day of class, because I'm not a procrastinator, but I am certainly someone who up to the 11th hour is still deciding between texts that I'm going to teach, deciding between, you know, assignments that I'm going to have. And so you could look 4 days before class and there still might be some changes that could be made. But yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing that I'm thinking about, that there's this level of expectation, and sometimes instructors don't see it the same way that students see it. But, it's very interesting that you say you want to know what the course is about. You want to see what's in the course. And it's not even an online course a lot of times, right? Even in your face-to-face class, you have that expectation, right?
Yeah.
And I invited Carrie and Rachel here because they're straddling this line, which is very interesting, between student and an instructor. You're new instructors, and I'm wondering, with that information, that desire to get a Canvas course up, to know all the things that are going on in the course, you're also seeing it from a student and simultaneously as a student and an instructor. I mean, are there some things that strike you? I mean, I guess one of my questions would be, are there advantages or positives that you really like about Canvas? And feel free to jump around and say, well, but there's also some cons to it.
So I'll speak about one experience that I had as an undergraduate student. I did have a professor that preferred that I email my papers to him versus online. And so that was not something that I enjoyed. To Ethan's point, like, you have that expectation of, I'm going to submit it on Canvas. I can see that it was successfully sent, and then any kind of comments that he might respond back, I anticipated that. I wanted that. But as far as like navigating, from student to instructor, I really appreciate and like having Canvas, because it is a means for me to communicate and to deliver my content. And I think that students expect and they want that. They want that digital connection so that they can look ahead and say, I can see what's coming up.
Yeah, that part has been a little tricky for me, because I really am figuring this out as I go along, because I'm teaching English composition, which I love, and I have a bit of a background in English language teaching, like teaching immigrants and people who want to speak English as a second or foreign language. But, coming into the Canvas side of things, I had to try to get everything decided at once. And like my first semester especially, I hadn't taught in Canvas before, and there was quite the steep learning curve, because I had worked as a professional grader for a different institution, and so I had, some familiarity with SpeedGrader, which is what we use to grade student assignments. And I also had some experience, taking online classes, but just the sheer amount of like decisions that you had to make. And yeah, you can change some things here and there, but it's like, okay, you have to get your syllabus completely ready. You have to get your schedule completely ready. You have to try to have these things so they are ready for students to see on day one. And so I've kind of adapted a little bit. I didn't have things as filled out as I would have liked. I did have a clear schedule. These are the big projects. These are the big project days. But I've also been... Canvas does have a really nice feature where you can decide if you want to publish something or not. And so that has been helpful for me as I've been organizing the course. And so it's like, okay, I can stick this in this week. Oh, well, I'm deciding to move it to a different week. And so, next semester, when I teach a class that I've taught before, because I've been teaching new classes both times and building completely new things, next semester it'll be much easier to have a fuller schedule. But in the meantime, I've been very much learning Canvas as I go. Even with training and things, it's still just a very different interface. And then you have to figure out, how do quizzes work? How do discussions work? How do papers work? And then, I have to decide what kind of file types they can submit with. And there's just so many decisions that have to be made as an instructor that can be pretty overwhelming.
On Canvas, there's this feature where you can flip, as an instructor, you can flip from student view to instructor view. And so I think in this conversation, we will move around between instructor view and student view. And you brought up a really good point about this expectation that the course needs to be developed when it's in Canvas. And there was a part of me that, and we'll talk a little bit about personal experience in classroom. I do recall as a student a time without Canvas, and a time when it was just, I got the syllabus and, show up next week reading pages something to something and we'll see what happens. And there's not this time where all the PowerPoints for the class are posted online. And so from the instructor view, there's this degree of pressure that you brought up, which is everything needs to be available. But then also the empathy that I have for a student is, why wouldn't I as an instructor have the course developed from day one? So how do you feel about that idea of getting your course developed and that pressure to have everything online, to have everything stored on there?
It's part of what's tricky to me, like I said, is just that I do much better navigating the dynamics of the classroom than I do the online course. And that's not to say that I'm bad with technology or things. It's just very different. And so, like, you know, if I want to change what's assigned for homework or something, you know, is it what it says on Canvas or not? It's just like, I don't want to change things on the students too much, even if I find something is more appropriate than another thing. And so I feel like if I don't have to have it there like 3 weeks in advance, then I can have that flexibility and change. And so my Canvas is more bare than I'd like, but I do know the concepts I want to teach. It's almost like I have like 2 lessons or 3 lessons in my head for the students. And then class time is where it's like, okay, this is the one that's more important today. And so that's kind of where I'm struggling. And we'll see how it is next semester when I have, you know, my Canvas modules already built for the courses that I can teach.
I am also building my 2010 class as a hybrid class, so meaning that we meet once a week face-to-face, and then the rest of my content is delivered online. And so there is a certain aspect about being in the classroom and having that flexibility to adapt on demand. I can get instant feedback from my students, and I can kind of tell on their faces how they're receiving the information. Versus online, it is different. I'll speak to just a little challenge that I've had is that I've done little mini recordings, little mini lectures, and I load those up online. So that was one of the things that I felt like, to Carrie's point, it takes a little bit of time, a little practice in getting the content online the way that you want to get it loaded. But then I had an experience the other day. Just 2 days ago, I had a student email me, and I love these students that they cushion the problem with a compliment. And so what I mean,
professional skill.
It is.
She was so gracious, and so what she did, she emailed me, and she was like, "I genuinely love your course. I really appreciate that you give us the deadlines and you tell us what's coming up." And then she's like, "But I do have a question about this assignment. I can watch the video, but I cannot add my comments to it." And so to Randy's point, it's choosing. I had loaded the assignment as a page versus an assignment, and so it's just learning, how to properly get the assignment loaded for that hybrid course. But overall, I would say that I'm really loving it, because I feel like I'm just adding another skill to my tool belt.
I had an experience just in class yesterday with my students where I, had been deciding on a major project, and it's like, okay, I decided I'm going to use this one. And so I copied a big essay over from our department chair's sandbox module that he has, and then I was going to modify it and things like that. And so I did, I made my own version of it for my students. But when I got to, and I had to change the due date. Well, when I got to class, my students were all like, "What's going on with our grades? We have this 0 for this paper that hasn't happened yet." And because of the settings I had, Dr. Peterson had it assigned at a previous point in the semester, and so Canvas automatically gave everybody 0s for this major final essay, which is a significant portion of their grade. And so then all of a sudden I was like, wait, how do I navigate this? Because I don't want them to have a 0 showing, but they haven't done the assignment yet. I don't want to give everybody 100, so I had to try to quickly figure out how to navigate that. But to me, I had changed the due date. It's okay, it's not actually due. It's just that it had automatically populated 0s for not submitting something when it was initially loaded and due.
Interesting.
When it's funny, I have had that experience as an instructor that I'll have something that pops up and, oh, that student looks like they're failing because I didn't enter a grade. Oh, whoops. And I'll fix it. But so Ethan, on the student end, how does it feel when things don't go what's expected on Canvas? It's probably more terror than I feel, probably, as an instructor.
Yeah, it's confusing. I think I'm probably not great. I don't know. I'm not always super worried about my grades personally, and that sounds really bad, but that's not how I approach school. Like I put in the effort, and I always just kind of hope that things will work out. So for me, if something shows up that I know it's not right, then for me it's like, oh, well, that's not right, and we'll fix it. But I think one of the things for me, with different instructors, people use it differently. Different instructors use it differently. And so if you upload something as a file or as a page, like there's different areas where different instructors will upload, whether they're like PDFs or assignments. And one thing that I've had to realize is as I get to know certain instructors, people will, sometimes in a course, there will be files under pages. Sometimes it'll be under files. Sometimes it'll be under modules. And it can get confusing sometimes trying to find when somebody says, oh, today we're discussing this reading that you were supposed to read. And sometimes I'm like, oh, well, I couldn't even find it. I mean, I checked in 3 different places. Sometimes it feels like, and I'm not even sure where you posted this. And so there's been times for me where I'm not even sure how to access something, even though it's on Canvas, and that sounds great. But sometimes once you actually get on Canvas, you realize it's not as simple as, and if people use it differently, then as a student, if the instructor, builds it differently than as a student, I have to access it differently. And if somebody's using it in a way that I've never seen before, then it's going to throw me off. But
yeah, and I think that there's a theoretical element to this, going back to Jim's comment about the days before Canvas and learning management systems. I was a student, in fact, I finished my graduate work without ever, I took an online course or two, but I never took a face-to-face course that had a learning management system as part of it. And one of the, there's positives and negatives, and part of it is, you started to describe it, Jim, the kind of demystification of the relationship between the student and the professor. In the old days, a lot of times if you were new, particularly to a school, they didn't even know what the professor looked like, and you're waiting for the professor to come through the door and share with you the syllabus on that first day. And then after you turn in a hard copy assignment and you were told, okay, the papers will be graded or the exams will be returned on this day, and you waited in anticipation for that time, that class time was when you were going to get your assignment back. And of course, Canvas makes it so that a lot of that isn't quite as mystical as it once was. Our grades, we could make a setting in Canvas that not to release grades on an assignment until everybody's is graded. I don't use that feature. So once I finish grading an assignment, the student can see the grade, can see my comments. And I think that's great. I think that's a great feature for students, and I think it helps in their learning process. But at the same time, over the years using Canvas, I've kind of developed a system where I wait until I make everything available. So I've got an entire class schedule for the semester that my students can see, but assignments and even resources like, I guess if we're going to be old-fashioned, lecture notes aren't available until I get closer to that time, because you have students who take the opposite extreme and say, I'm going to do everything in the first 3 weeks because I know I'm going to be busy at the end of the semester. So they're doing assignments that are going to be based a lot on class discussion and interaction with their fellow students and things like that. So you have to be kind of very careful. Canvas makes it so we need to be at our best as professors. Like you said, have the course ready to go. To make a sports metaphor, I think of it as the new transfer portal. And I've heard, people interviewed, coaches interviewed who don't like the transfer portal. It's like we have to keep recruiting them all the time. And I'm like, thinking, yeah, you've got to, live up to your promises all the time because they might transfer and go someplace else. And I think that we're held to a same level of accountability with the learning management system, that we can't just, we all know the story of the professor who kind of flies by the seat of his or her pants and doesn't do anything until the very last minute and isn't very organized. It's hard to be that professor in the day and age of Canvas. It's really hard to get away with some of that kind of stuff, and I think that's good for the students. But at the same time, and this is the philosophical point, Canvas needs to be there to serve the learning that goes on in the classroom and as a result of the classroom. If it were just, I'm going to put everything on Canvas, all of my lecture notes are there, all of my PowerPoint slides are there, all of my assignments are there, we could do this without even really wasting our time of meeting in the classroom. Let's get rid of that. Well, then you've got an online class in a lot of ways, right? I mean, that's a different way of learning. So philosophically, I'm always striving to make sure that Canvas is serving the learning that primarily happens, or at least is started in those 150 minutes per week that we meet in the classroom.
One of the things that you were talking about in that is this idea of personalization. The concept that it encourages us to strive as instructors to grow in our pedagogy, but at the same time, I was thinking when you were talking about earlier on in there is kind of when our online course training, the emphasis of building connection with students, being aware of the fact that in an online course, there's such a distance between the student. And I was actually thinking with our previous conversation with AI, it's like, it would be terrifying to think that a student who I've never met could just create AI writing, and then there's just this completely artificial relationship in the learning process. That they're turning in work that's not theirs, and they're not making any connection in the learning environment. So we have to strive in Canvas to make that connection. And I'll say this. I really wanted to say this because that personalization, for me, there's some nostalgia there. The fact is that I remember getting papers back and flipping to the final page to see if I got that A, that exciting, like, good job, Jim. And versus now where it would just pop up as a screen. And I wonder, how much is that personalization either lost or just transformed in the learning process?
I know that for me, with my experiences in online classes, I did not have a connection with my teachers or my programs. And part of that, is just that we were still figuring it out as we're going along and things. This was pre-pandemic. I would hope that people post-COVID-19 pandemic and all the shutdown and everything have grown a better awareness of the power and the lack that online classes can have. But I do feel like a lot of times Canvas does help, at least for me, because it does have clear visual organization. This is what we're doing. I'm able to use it to say, these are the due dates very clearly. Like, I use little headers that say, due Tuesday in class, due Thursday in class, due Saturday night, so that I can give my students those clear expectations.
I'll make a comment on that. So as far as that connection and that community that you build with the students, I had a professor this last semester. I had a proposal that I turned in, and I thought the way that she handled my final paper and her grading was brilliant. So we were in the classroom, and she was delivering grades to everybody. So she held back before she published it, and then she published it, and she said, okay, you can take a look at your grades now. And she goes to go to the back page to see my love note. And I loved that she said that. Go to the back page so you can see my love note. So I think that as an instructor, it is what we do to make that connection to the student. My background, I should say my undergraduate degree is in communication studies, and so I really embrace the idea that communication is the lifeblood of relationships. So that's our responsibility to make those personal comments back on the students' papers so that they feel comfortable in talking to us, following up with us, or having follow-up conversations in the classroom. If it is a hybrid or an online class, I really like that follow-up communication.
I have a comment on that as well. As a student, it's rare these days that I turn in a hard copy of a paper, but I also love getting back a hard copy of a paper with notes on it. But when I get Canvas notifications that there's comments being made on a paper I've submitted, sometimes I almost don't want to check those, and I don't know why that is. But it feels like cold, and sometimes it does, there's that distance between me and the instructor. When I can read somebody's handwriting, there's a more personal element to it. But then sometimes, sometimes when I turn in a paper, I feel good about it, and I feel like I did good work. And sometimes I feel like that wasn't as good as I could have done. And so then sometimes I know there's going to be criticisms, and sometimes it's like, well, I don't want to see comments on this criticizing my work because I already know it wasn't that great. And and so sometimes it takes me a couple days to look at those comments. Whereas if I get a hard copy back, I'm excited to see what are even the criticisms. How can this be better? But sometimes Canvas to me makes me scared of getting comments on my work, and I don't know exactly why that is, but it happens.
So one thing that, the impersonal nature, can, kind of have us miss out on the relationships that we can form with students and the personalized interactions and things. But it also was really useful when I was a professional grader. And my goal was, okay, I need to grade these 120 assignments this week. I need to grade all these essays so that the students can get good, actionable feedback back and they can move on to other concepts. And in that regard, when I didn't know who the students were, because I was just assigned a queue, it's like first in, first out, I could grade very quickly and very efficiently and be consistent and not have, for me, some of the anxieties and concerns over the students that I now grade for in person. And so it takes a little longer to grade for them, even though, I still do my best to grade objectively and things. All of a sudden, there's more emotions involved than there were the previous time, which is good and bad because, I can give targeted instruction to my students that I grade for personally, but I'm only grading for, 22 students this semester, whereas I was grading for like 120, which, it was different circumstances and things, but just there are pros and cons and trade-offs.
Yeah, and I think you have to strike a balance. As an instructor, you have to try to strike a balance in that relationship because I really like a lot of, and I can relate to a lot of the comments that have been given about this idea of that connection between student and teacher. And you struggle sometimes and you strive for it with online classes, and it is definitely harder. But in those face-to-face classes, you have that connection. But is the connection too close sometimes? In the early days here, and Jim, you'll probably remember, we go through, training for online courses, and it kind of gravitated from being an online principal to being a face-to-face principal. Oh, if a student emails you, you should email them right back. They need to get that immediate response from you. And I remember in one session, now you're not required to respond to them, over the weekend, but if I were you, I sure would do that. And all of a sudden you start thinking in your mind, what's my responsibility if a student emails me, a non-emergency concern at 11 o'clock on a Friday night? Am I obligated, and I happen to be, awake and I see the message come in, what's my obligation as far as that relationship goes? I think that's something that we need to think about. We're sharing kind of quirky stories. I had a student, and I didn't even realize you could do that, but she had set her notifications so that anytime I made a comment in Canvas SpeedGrader, she got an update. And in composition courses, particularly in the draft stage of assignments, I make a lot of comments, content comments, but also grammar and style comments. And, I was going over her draft, 10 o'clock at night, 10:30 at night, and made 25 plus comments on the paper. And she told me the next time she saw me in class, my notification kept going off. I kept getting this notification that you had made a comment. And I'm like, you got to change those notifications. You can't get a notification every time I make a comment. So that was there wasn't a negative aspect to it, but that was a perfect example of that's when the student-teacher relationship has to be a little less strongly connected, right?
I had one instance where I was giving annotated feedback on someone's submission, and they noticed and they kept leaving comments of their own, like trying to respond to me and talk to me while I'm trying to focus on grading. And it was a little tricky because it's like I'm not done grading yet. Like I literally have like 3 comments on like the first page. And so it was a little distracting and interrupting because it's like, I need to focus on your assignment. I'll talk to you later.
Yeah, and I can see, I think I can see what was in that student's mind. They were seeing it as a kind of online conversation, which we're so familiar with in other contexts where it is literally a conversation, and you weren't striving for that at that time, and I could see how it could distract you from getting your grading done.
Especially because in that role, I was just a grader. I was not the instructor, and they say, respond to grader questions through this specific form. And so part of that is like institutional rules. It's like the graders are supposed to be objective and not do things. So like I was involved with Canvas and evaluating, but that they're supposed to like follow up with their instructor or submit through this one process. And so it was hard because I did want to talk to that student. I did want to say, hang on a minute and things like that. But in that specific role, I was only using Canvas to evaluate their work and was not supposed to talk with that student. And so that's just another thing that can come up with Canvas as, system philosophies for using Canvas. How do you use Canvas? How do you have instructors use roles? Do you have graders? But that's a whole nother discussion.
I'm going to add to this. So I had Randy as a professor. I took one of your courses. It was 2600.
And it was online, right?
And it was online. And I was that student. It was like...
Oh, this is like the story of you that he's talking about?
No. It was not me, but a very similar experience. So I'm going to say that when Ethan was like, I almost don't want to check, I had a mixed bag of emotion because I was getting, it was like real-time comments that I was receiving on one of my assignments that I had turned in. And it was, you can have improvement here. I would like to see this. I really like this. And it was coming to me like real time. So it was fun, but I can see from a professor perspective, I don't want to have my students try to engage with me while I'm grading their paper.
Yeah, it's like I said, I think it's a balance that you have to strike. I think, going back to that physical copy that we've talked about a couple of times, I think you could tell a lot, or at least this is a personal thing, I guess, I could tell a lot easier when you're maybe making too many comments. There's research out there that suggests that, too much feedback, even in a draft situation, when, okay, this is literally the rough draft of a research paper that you are then going to take my suggestions and turn into a final draft, that you can overdo it. And students will shut down sometimes when they see just too many comments. And, I struggle, and I think it's part of my training in composition, and I feel as though I have to help my students improve their writing. So that means most of my comments come off as being, you did this wrong, or you could do this better if you did this. So they come off being, negative comments. And students in an online environment, even if it's a face-to-face class, but they're receiving that feedback online, it could just be overload really quickly, and then the whole purpose is defeated. Then they're not reading the feedback, and they're not going to take those suggestions into consideration as they prepare the final draft. So, I guess that's my theme, because this is probably the third time I've said it. You got to strike a balance, right, in terms of the comments that you make. Pick the most important comments and focus on those, and set the nature of the relationship between yourself and the student at a certain level, and then keep it that way, because I think that's the most beneficial. We want to demystify the student-professor relationship, but at the same time, there's still a level of separation that needs to exist there.
Well, and the consistent theme of technology is we're going to make your life easier. So it's supposed to make your life easier as a student to be on Canvas. And then I think about too many comments. I think about the fact that, in different commenting programs, you can cut and paste or have template. And it's true. I mean, a comma splice is a comma splice. And so I don't need to keep explaining it differently. But at the same time, I look at some papers that I send out to students, and it's all just sort of template responses. And I wonder about that personalized aspect of, am I actually helping the student personally, or am I just looking at a paper as fast as possible and efficiently? And it's not a personal exchange. It's just a computer diagnostic of their paper.
So we'll take the next step to what you talked about before. We'll have AI generating the work, and we'll have AI responding to the work, and the student, we and the students can go out and have a cup of coffee and just enjoy the nice weather, right?
In my usual theme of analogies that only relate to people in my own generation, it's like the scene in Real Genius, if you've seen that, where all it is the instructor has a recorder giving a lecture, and the students are just recording it, and so everybody's doing something else while the machines are doing it. I also wanted to mention that I think Canvas solved some of this personalization problem by adding emojis in the comment section.
I like that too.
I always think it's funny. I'm like, well, it's great but it's also in this social media vein where there's no emojis that are negative. So there's no like, you failed, and then like a bomb exploding on it. But it's all about like claps and hearts and things that are on the emojis.
Well, that's good. That balances out my negative comma splice and unclear pronoun comments.
Just stick a smiley face on it.
Exactly. Ethan, let me ask you this. When you have an assignment and you say sometimes you don't like to maybe look at the comments right away, what are the kinds of things you're expecting from your professors? I know you said you're an English major in the Lit Studies emphasis, so you probably write a lot of critical literature, critical theoretical type essays. Are you looking for formative comments that help you improve, or are you looking for instructors to talk about, this is where you did a good job on this, or maybe some combination of all of those things?
I think it's a combination, but I think for me, I always hope that my instructors will help me improve as a writer. So if there's improvements that can be made, that's stuff that I want to hear, because if I'm good at one thing and instructors always tell me I'm good at this, and I never, I get scared that if there's something I could do better at, but nobody ever says this is a weakness or here's something to work on. If I'm not getting constructive feedback, criticism, am I actually going to improve as a writer? And so I do look for some criticisms, because I expect that I can make lots of improvements. And ironically, after I actually check the comments, sometimes I end up wishing that there was still actually more. But I think for me, in my own analogy, it's almost like if somebody sends you a message or calls you or texts you and says, hey, can I ask you a favor? As opposed to just asking you a favor. For me, if somebody says, hey, can you do something for me? I always kind of have to say, well, maybe, depends on what it is. Why don't you just tell me, And so it's like if I'm being told there's comments being made on your paper, as opposed to, looking at it and seeing the comment, I think it's almost kind of like, oh, the comments. That's that could mean anything, and so it becomes kind of like, oh well, what if it's bad comments, and what if I did a poor job, or what if my paper is much worse than I imagined it was. So I think for me it's easy to get carried away, but I definitely look for criticisms, as well as maybe a few things where maybe I didn't realize something was as effective as it was, or something like that. But yeah, I'm pretty open-minded, I think, when I do get feedback.
I don't know if it makes you feel any better that this trauma just never goes away about what the comments are about, but it's funny, whenever I get a notification for a student commenting on one of my comments, I immediately assume it's like, how dare you? And then usually it's like, thank you for your feedback. It's almost always that way. And what I always think is really funny is that maybe there is this deep down aspect of getting that comment that it's just so much more jarring versus, a love note.
It's ominous.
It is. It's just sort of, I don't know if I just don't expect good news to come digitally.
And that might, again, connect to that kind of mystification of the relationship between the professor and the student. That, in the old-fashioned model, the professor is the person who has all the knowledge and is going to share that knowledge with the student. And the student is going to be called upon to do certain tasks, and the professor is going to criticize the student primarily in a way to make them, perform the tasks better. And I think, like the high-minded platitudes that we hear about, the internet has democratized knowledge and democratized all these things. I think there is, to some extent, a democratizing element to a learning management system like Canvas that does allow that relationship to not be the master holds the secret and that master is going to share it with the apprentice.
One of the really nice things about Canvas as a student, I think, is the ability to share your knowledge and information without the social anxiety of the classroom. For introverted students or for anxious students, I know for me, I've gotten a lot more comfortable talking with people, but it is nice that, even if you're too shy to talk in class, you can still share your brilliant thoughts on there. And it's also, of course, very handy for disabled students or students who, are non-traditional students. Like, I loved having online, learning management software as a student when I had my 3 young kids at home. And so it has these trade-offs, but it definitely is a good tool that does have benefits for a lot of situations. It's just definitely not the same as in person.
I had a student last semester tell me, we were in class, and at the end of the class, she came up and she said, "I would rather not come to class than ask you a question in class in front of everybody." And that was just so sobering to me. She was an excellent communicator through email. She asked me one question after another through email for clarifications or looking ahead, or is it okay if I do this in my paper? But that was something that I felt was really sobering, that she had that much anxiety in speaking out in front of others in the classroom.
And so much of education is stretching students, but not breaking them. And so encouraging them to, stretch themselves within their comfort zone. And I think, previous to Canvas and these online options, it was just sort of like you come to class and you do a student presentation or you fail. And now there are these. I remember very early on in online education training the concept of the discussion thread and the idea that a student can share their thoughts because they just weren't comfortable raising their hand in class, and other people can see their thoughts and they can respond to them. And I think that's a wonderful option for those students. And once again, striking balance, striking this idea of like, how can you use Canvas so that it's not something that sort of dulls learning, but enhances it, and stretches certain students, but at the same time, also gives them the opportunity to succeed in small ways if they need incremental growth.
I just wanted to make a quick announcement that's going to connect to our next show. Jim and I will be talking to folks at the Digital Humanities 7 conference up in Cedar City at SUU, and that's taking place February 24th and 25th. Several of our graduate students, our master's students here from Utah Tech, will be participating in that conference. I've attended several of them. It's really a great place to go and learn about the really great projects that are going on in the state, but also in the region involving digital humanities. So we're gonna be talking to some folks there. I don't know if we're going to do a live podcast. We haven't decided on that yet, but that's where we're going to be. So be on the lookout for that episode of the Being Human UT podcast.
I think we could probably talk quite a bit more about Canvas, but I think that this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much, Carrie, Rachel, and Ethan. And it was a wonderful conversation, and we're going to wrap up. So join us next time on Being Human UT.
This has been the Being Human UTU podcast with Dr. Randy Jasmine and Dr. Jim Hindigas. Please follow and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. From Utah Tech University, this is the Being Human UTU podcast. This has been a production from a podcast studio.